And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sandy Rauer, the 5 Points 2016 guest lecturer. Sandy is president and founding director of the Calder Foundation, and he is Alexander Calder's grandson. Under Sandy's guidance, the Calder Foundation was established in 1987 and has to date documented more than 22,000 works that belong to Alexander Calder. I have to confess that as a grandmother, I have a special place in my heart for grandsons. And so, Sandy has curated and collaborated on over 85 solo Calder exhibitions across the world. They include projects at the Tate Modern, London, Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow, the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in St. Louis, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and I can go on, the Pompidou in Paris, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Guggenheim, the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And he's published many texts on the life of his grandfather. And he will tonight talk to us about this great legacy that Alexander Calder has left to all of us. And I know, and I think I know, that all of us in the northwest corner of Connecticut sort of feel that we own a little bit of Alexander Calder because he's a little bit a part of northwestern Connecticut. And yet the whole world appreciates who this man was. And through Alexander's vision, or Sandy's vision, we'll learn more about that tonight. Thank you. And will you please help me welcome Sandy Rauer to 5 Points Gallery.
But Calder was not a little piece of Connecticut. It was a big piece of Connecticut. Now, can you turn off those lights in my eyes? Now, this picture over here, I started with about 500 images, and Judy said, no, a few less than 500 would be better. So this is actually a picture in Connecticut. That's why I'm beginning with this picture of my grandfather. This is 1936. He's in his little tiny studio in Roxbury, Connecticut. We call this the Ice House Studio because it was actually the farmer's ice house where the farmer kept his milk and kept it cool before it went on the train down to New York City. And my grandfather converted that ice house into a dirt floor, very, very modest space, which you'll see later. The reason I'm showing this picture of my great-grandfather is because it's a recently found picture. It's not the best picture of Alexander Sterling Calder, my grandfather's father, but it's a great picture of him, and I'm excited about this picture. So just a little history. Probably almost everybody here knows that Calder's grandfather was a famous sculptor, and Calder's father was a famous sculptor, and Calder was a pretty famous sculptor himself. So this is Alexander Sterling Calder sculpting in his studio, and this is one of Alexander Sterling Calder's most famous works in Philadelphia, the Swan Memorial Fountain in Logan Circle. There's an occasion where Calder's grandfather made the giant sculpture of William Penn, the founder of the state of Pennsylvania, on top of City Hall in Philadelphia. And then down the avenue is this sculpture by the son. And then in the Philadelphia Museum is a giant mobile. So you have the three generations of these great sculptors together. It's the only place outside of the Calder Foundation or one of our houses that you can see the three generations together in one place. It's a wonderful occurrence. This is my grandfather as a boy. This sculpture is owned by the Metropolitan in New York. It's my grandfather as a boy by his father, and he's there holding an orange in his hand. As your director, who's a grandmother, said, it's wonderful to see these little kids. So this is a boy by his dad, and then he gets a little older by his father also. This sculpture is called Laughing Boy, but it's Sandy Calder as a boy. And then here's a painting by his mother of him in a sailor suit. His mother was a portrait painter, a decent painter. So here's my grandfather as a boy with his mom on the beach in California. Some things I'll talk a lot more about, some things I'll speak much less about. But here are a few things that he made as a boy. Sir Lancelot du Lac, and then the Pasadena Express and Ice Company, things he was doing in Pasadena at that time. This is one of my favorite works of art that he ever made, a self-portrait at the age of 9 of himself with the tools that his family would give him for Christmas, a tool. And he built this workshop eventually with all these different tools, but it's wonderful to see him there with his his drill brace and his famous pliers and his hammer and his saw and so forth. This little duck is not a toy, but it's actually really tiny, but it looks really big on the screen. It's a piece of flat sheet brass which he drew the geometry on, cut out with like scissors, which snips. There are pencil lines here. You can actually see them still on the sculpture. They haven't been worn away. So what's critically important is here's this young boy, it's 1909 or so, and he prefigures the geometry for the final composition of this object. I call it an object because, it's not a toy, it's a sculpture, which he gives two sculptures, a dog and a duck, to his parents for Christmas in 1909. But the idea that he could see it geometrically in his head as a kid and draw it, snip it out, and then fold it. There are two hemispheres here you can see. So there's a ridge line on the back and these two hemispheres. So if you tap the tail, this duck can actually rock. It's the first documented kinetic work by Calder. And it's an extraordinary thing. It's way before he becomes an engineer and all that stuff. And I kind of poo-poo the whole thing about Calder being an engineer because all throughout his childhood he was making things that were very innovative. And the whole thing about engineering was his parents didn't want him to suffer. They didn't want him to be an artist. Like, they were both artists and they both suffered and they didn't want him to suffer. So they encouraged him to go study engineering. I'll jump over his education, and post-engineering, he goes out to the West Coast, and he's a timekeeper in a logging camp, which means he's the one who figures out how many hours you work the week and how much you get paid, and he's sort of like doing an accounting job. And he writes to his mother, and he asks her for paints and some canvases and some brushes, and he paints the logging scene. Now, this is really a tragic image, right? A devastated forest. I mean, there's just, it's a wasteland. This is the earliest oil painting that we know of. This is in the Calder Foundation collection. And then he decides, okay, I'm going to be an artist. I'm going to give up these other kind of dead-end jobs. He moves back to New York, and he studies at the Art Students League, and he makes these kind of paintings. He's studying with John Sloan and George Lukes and the Ashcan, his father's generation, and most of these guys were his father's friends. What's striking about these paintings, though, is that it's New York by night, which seems kind of obvious today, but in those days, in the 1920s, New York being lit by electric light was pretty formidable. These next paintings, really done at the same time, around 1924. This is about kineticism. This is a bike race. This one has this exotic point of view. It's a tennis tournament, but he's not painting the tennis tournament. Here he's got this giant ship in the harbor. It's actually under construction, and he's painting large, buoyant pieces of steel, which of course become a subject matter after the 1950s. Giant pieces of steel is what Calder really becomes very famous for. Studying construction, a lot of these construction sites in New York in the 1920s, they were 24-hour-a-day construction sites. They were lit by light at night. Lots of accidents happened. Everything was being built so very quickly. And he went around town and documented this kind of bursting energy of New York. Of course, this is, all stops once the stock market crash happens. Everything grinds to a halt. In 1925, my grandfather publishes this book. And it's a book that he both wrote and illustrated as kind of a treatise on how to use a brush and make ink drawings. It's really an incredible book because we get to understand something about what Calder's going to become. There's so much action in these quick brush studies. He would go to the Bronx Zoo and the New York Central Park Zoo and do these images of animals. They're sort of Japanese, like sumi painting. They're like a lot of things. But his treatise is basically talking about the action of the animal, the potential action of the animals in these images, even these kind of lines. And we start to understand how he distills these animals into his very famous wire sculptures that are just about to burst forward. Even this reduction here of this monkey is, I think, an extraordinary brush drawing. I'm not going to talk a lot about the circus tonight, but the circus was a work of performance art. So my grandfather had this idea that you could distill the reality of an event into a microcosm, and then present it, both with humor, but also with a lot of intellectual intensity. I love these photographs. These ones are by Herbert Matter. We have other ones by Brassai. Other great photographers photographed the circus in the late 20s. You can see most of these elements, the objects, the performers are made from wire, scraps and bits of things. Here you go. So the circus became something that introduced Calder to a lot of people in Paris. So he's in Paris since 1926, and by performing in his studio, this strange thing, no one had ever seen such a thing before. Of course, you know, the introduction of artists to stage performance or ballet, the ballet russe, was something that was happening a lot in the 1920s. But that you could perform this little tiny thing in your own studio was really weird. That's all I'm going to say about it. This is one of Calder's first wire sculptures that's made completely out of wire. It's not made from cork, wood, rubber, wire, cloth, like the circus figures. It's a depiction of Josephine Baker. It's arguably the very first sculpture made completely from wire. My grandfather did 5 different versions of her over the next few years. This one is owned by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And then finally, this is the 5th version. This is owned by the Calder Foundation, and it's called Josephine Aztec, or Aztec Josephine Baker, just because she's very squarish. We've tried to find an image of Josephine Baker, the famous cabaret performer, in an Aztec kind of outfit, but we haven't been able to find. I don't think he was really depicting her in a specific role. I think he was just made her very squarish and decided she was sort of Aztec. Here you can see his progression. It's basically 1926 to 1930. How the first one is formalized by this wooden block like you would a bronze or a marble sculpture, and the last one is suspended from a wire and is completely articulated. There are little hinges everywhere, all through her ankles, everywhere, her wrists. So she really is kind of a proto-mobile. She hangs, she's suspended, she's actionable. You can interact with her, and a whole different kind of vocabulary is coming from the same subject matter. It's a fascinating shift and transition here in his development. So at the same time, making wire sculpture, I'm going to return to this rearing stallion later. This is owned by the National Gallery in Washington, which just opened a permanent Calder gallery. If any of you have a chance to get to Washington, well, you can go whenever you want because it's permanent, but they have this incredible new gallery, jam-packed. It's stuffed full of Calder. There are almost too many Calders in there, but not really. It's really an extraordinary assemblage. This is 1928, and it's very difficult to understand today what wire sculpting was for artists and for society, how you could define a mass without presenting any physical mass. It's not bronze, it's not marble, it's not precious. He's just drawing the lines that define a volume. And people had a really hard time understanding what he was doing, because it wasn't sculpture. It wasn't sculpture, it wasn't painting, it wasn't drawing. What was it? So he made a few classical subjects. So this is Romulus and Remus, the she-wolf of Rome. This is Calder's actual postcard of Romulus and Remus. And so you can see he's made this she-wolf that's suckling the 2 humans, like this classical sculpture that anyone who studies art history knows this sculpture. Here is Hercules battling the lion. This is almost life-size. The figure is almost the size of a human. It's also suspended, also rotates like a mobile will shortly. And my own sense is that he was really trying to help people understand the vocabulary of wire sculpting. And to a certain degree, people started to get what it was. This is the #1 most requested sculpture that the foundation has. This goldfish bowl is a beautiful drawing. It's the 3-dimensional object, of course, but these fish, you can see their little hinges here. There's a crank over here, And if you crank if you crank it, you'll get arrested. But you crank the mechanism and it moves all this up here, and the fish don't just bang back and forth like a hinged door. The fish have this beautiful fluid motion. It's extraordinary to see it in motion. And sometimes we shoot a video of that kind of thing in an exhibition and post the video next to the sculpture to try and give people the sense of what it does. The thing about wire sculpting, though, is that so many subjects came out of wire sculpting for Calder. So in the case of these wire portraits, which are mostly suspended and they rotate, so he realized that when you shine a light on these wires, it projects a shadow on the wall. And that shadow, which is a two-dimensional surface, a two-dimensional shadow, obviously, is actually more three-dimensional in appearance than the physical object itself. You can see that the wires appear to be in focus, right, from the camera angle, but if you look at the shadows have depth to them. Sometimes it's hard to see which is the shadow and which is the sculpture. You can all see that this is the wire over here, right, and the shadow is this one over here. So he intentionally presented these wire portraits with light and shadows to give this kind of cinematographic effect on the wall, which the point was to show that something that seemed to be alive. He was always after the question of what is the basic question of spirituality, what is alive, what is the life force, what is that twinkle, what is that thing? He was, pretty much everything he did was about the question of aliveness. And if his sculpture gave the presence of something more than itself, just a piece of wire, then he was satisfied. Here he is in Paris in his studio. He's working on a portrait. The lady is Kiki de Montparnasse, who was a very famous, Alice Prynne was her real name, but she was known to be everybody's model. She sat as a model and as a nude model for all of the great artists from, certainly Man Ray and Modigliani and all these great artists in Paris. And Calder made this wire portrait of her. He actually made two versions of, this one's lost, and the other version is owned by the Pompidou in Paris. This is a portrait of my grandmother, actually. So Calder met his wife, my grandmother, on board ship. He was coming back from Paris, and she had gone to Europe with her father, who wanted her to meet suitable young men, because she was growing up in Boston and hanging out with all the wrong guys. So her dad took her and traveled her all around. They did a big tour. This is another view. And she came back on the boat with her dad, and she said all she met were doormen, concierge, taxi drivers. She met no suitable young men. And here they were walking along the deck of the boat, and her father says to her, "Look, here comes one now." And that was my grandfather. And what they didn't know is that my grandfather had been walking along behind them, and he was very admiring of her from the rear. And so he ran all the way around the deck to have a look at the front and realized that she was really special. So on board the ship, her hair had gone all corkscrewy with the sea air, and so he nicknamed her Medusa. So the title of his sculpture is actually Medusa, but it's a portrait of Louisa. I think I better go a little faster, otherwise we're going to be here all night. So the purpose of these next sculptures is to present the shift towards abstraction. So this is a rearing horse, rather like the rearing horse at the National Gallery. So this is a span of 2 years where the detail of even the horse's penis is well defined here. And in the other one, it's really about action. So it's a shift to identifying action as the subject as opposed to the fact that it's a horse or something else. This circus scene of 1929 is a tremendous transition to understanding how Calder felt about abstraction. So here you can see this guy is thick and thin wire, which is a representation of the energetic force that runs through the guy's body. So he's thrown his brother up in the air, right? The two guys in the middle have gone alley-oop to their brother, who's been caught by their big brother here. You can see, and the little brother has really just two wires defining his body. It's not a very good representation of the figure, but it's a representation of the lines of action. And then the board it's it's on is almost a kind of early painting abstraction. I'll get back to that. In October of 1930, Pete Mondrian comes to Calder's studio and sees a performance of the circus, and Calder's invited to go to Pete Mondrian's studio, which looked about like this. And Calder walks in. Now, Calder already knows the painting of Mondrian. It's not the paintings of Mondrian that is what excites Calder, or gave him the shock, as he said, the slap on his butt like a baby's breath, that converted him to fully be an abstract artist. It was the space of Mondrian's studio, this five-sided room with directional light coming in. Two sides were glass lit. And Calder saw these rectangles and suggested, so these rectangles are repositionable for compositional experiments. Mondrian had them just tacked to the wall, and Calder suggested that they should be made to oscillate, Calder's own word, which really irritated Mondrian. Mondrian said, my painting's already very fast. And Calder left Mondrian's studio and started painting in the abstract. This is one of those paintings. This is October 1930. He made 19 or 20 paintings that we know of in this moment. Now, this is a lot like the American abstract artists like Arthur Dove and so on. This one reminds me of that circus scene, just the palette, this kind of muted palette. It's not what we think of as Calder, as the bright colors and so on. Here he is at the time. Here he is with this painting. Here's just quickly a series of those paintings. Some are quite severe. Some you might relate to de Stijl, to what Pete Mondrian was, a proponent of, and so on. They're not really de Stijl. This one's a little like Kandinsky. And then these very odd paintings. This is a very odd painting. And then finally, this is the most popular painting of the whole series because it seems to be a picture of something. So it's a little bit easier to understand, even if it's just like a wire that goes out into the light and then back into the shadow. So he does those paintings for really 2 or 3 weeks. He stops painting, and he starts making abstract sculpture. So what you can't tell is that this is a hoop that intersects this other hoop that makes the sensation of a sphere. And this sphere trembles. It has this little trembling quality in opposition to that severe rod line that runs through it. So again, it's a question of how this, the energetic force is sort of shaking you. Just some relationship here. Here's another one of the early sculptures. This one's owned by the Whitney. And it reminds me, of course, of this painting, the way the base. This is probably one of the first abstractions in 1930 in its severity and this relationship with this painting. Here they are in the first show of abstraction in 1931. That's the Whitney one, and that was the first one you saw, which belongs to us. And then there, of course, are these portraits up here. So Calder's already famous for making these portraits. There's the Kiki de Montparnasse, there's Fernand Léger, and so forth. But he only really wants to show these abstract sculptures, but the dealer's like, are you crazy? You're famous for making all this other stuff, these recognizable things. No one's going to have a clue what this is, so he insisted that these get hung at the last second to give people reference, and hopefully he was hoping they would buy some of them, which of course nobody did. Here you have, again, like the fishbowl, you have a crank, and here's a crank, and here are these two spheres, a little blue one and a red one, that revolve inside this sphere. They actually, it's not so elegant because it actually bangs quite violently inside this sphere and makes all kinds of erratic and unpredictable motions. You think that Calder's all about the sublime, fluid motion like the fish, but actually he's also about jarring and giving juxtaposition in motion. This is one of the strangest sculptures because it's actually a wooden panel from a door. It's a recycled panel from a door. He liked the crackled surface. The mechanism behind that he made is essentially this wooden sphere goes around and around, and this wooden sphere goes up and down. And that's the entire composition. It has absolutely no meaning. Calder said it was deeply emotional, and if it had any meaning, it wouldn't be worthwhile. Now, that's a hard thing to wrap your mind around in 1931 when he made this sculpture. These kind of severe action sculptures that are about the composition of motion. Here's the sculpture that was in his studio when Marcel Duchamp visited his studio in Paris. Duchamp actually said, "Can I touch this?" And Calder, which was weird because it's not something it's not like a bronze you would caress or something. And the paint was still wet. And so Calder said, yeah, sure. And so Duchamp touched it and got wet paint on him. And Calder said, what should I call it? And Duchamp said, Mobile. Of course, Mobile. And Duchamp was making a pun because Mobile, which he had even used for his own work earlier in the 20s, Duchamp was suggesting that mobile in French, it refers to motion, but it also refers to motive. So it was this kind of multiple meaning, and Calder thought that was fantastic and seized the term. And mobiles, which later became hanging things that we're more familiar with. So this is where it really originates, a motorized object with a composition, a ballet composition in motion. Around the same time he made this sculpture, and this sculpture is even more radical because well, obviously it's a meditation on the sphere, right? There's a solid wooden ball, two discs that intersect that imply a sphere, and then there's a hoop, which is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional sphere. And that's great. But what you can't see is that you can actually slip this, there's a little loop of wire up here, you can slip the red one off and you can slip the black one off, and then this post is on a pin down here, and you can rotate this rod anywhere in 360 degrees and put the two spheres back on. So I'll show you what I mean. Here's a different composition of the same sculpture. He left the sculpture unfinished. He left it so that the viewer could change, or the owner could change the composition and determine the final ultimate composition. And everybody always asks me, so what did Calder choose? And the answer is he had no preference. He never made a diagram of the perfect composition. He always left it completely open. So the prior sculpture, Object with the Red Ball, is 1931. This is 1932. This is the very first hanging mobile. You can see there's a steel rod up here, and you can maybe barely see that from the end of it hangs a little white ball hanging down here, and from the other side, a heavy cast iron red ball. Now, these objects on the floor, these found and cast off and repurposed objects, this is a really radical thing, meaning that if an artist made this today, we go, wow, that's cool contemporary art. What he's doing is he's conceived of an idea of an experience for you to have. The work of art is about being an experience. So it's a conceptual work of art. It's not about the preciousness of these objects, meaning you could get on a plane, fly to Tokyo, hang up a rod, hang a heavy sphere on one side, a wooden sphere on the other, and put a whole bunch of other objects on the floor in your own composition. It's not about his specific idea. So you're supposed to take these things and scatter them about the floor or organize them however you want. You could put all the bottles in a row. You could put the metal things over here. Do whatever you want. And then you push the red sphere, and the little ball travels around and occasionally hits the objects. It doesn't always hit the objects. There's a sense of anticipation and release as these objects get hit. And of course, as they get hit, it makes a sound. And in making a sound, it becomes music. But it's really a strange thing. It has no, there's no score, of course, and every time it's performed, it's different. Even if it's the same composition on the floor, every time it's performed, it's different. Even if it's the same person pushing it, and so on. It's a really wild thing about how you feel when you experience it. Then right after, he starts making, oh, Wayne, here's some wooden balls. We were talking about these this afternoon. We're called to use wooden spheres in descending scale. This is actually 17 feet across. It's a really giant thing. So in 1932, when he made this sculpture, I have no idea what he was thinking. Where do you hang this? It wouldn't fit in this room. I mean, it would maybe just barely fit here between these posts and in this space, but you couldn't hang it high enough. You need a really big space to hang this, and nobody had a house in those days. Now people have big houses, but in those days, I have no idea what he was thinking. So here's a suite of actually Calder making jewelry. Here he's still in Paris. It's the end of the 20s, and I just put together a suite of jewelry to show different types of things he was doing. A tremendous vocabulary. I have a letter where Calder writes to his mother about he's walking along the ramparts in Calvi in Corsica, and he's picking up little blue and green bits of ancient pottery, just little shards. And here are the shards. And he writes to her, I'm sorry I can't be with you for your birthday. This is 1930. I'm sorry I can't be with your birthday. I found these shards in Corsica. I'm caging each one and stringing them together for a necklace, and he sends her this necklace for her birthday. And it's remained in the family, which is really fantastic. On the left is Peggy Guggenheim's famous mobile, and then just to give a sense of how you wear these completely unwearable mobile necklaces, you can see the scale of it. It's just giant. So this is Angelica Houston when she was just a young model in New York. She was hired to wear this necklace called The Jealous Husband. It actually has a title called The Jealous Husband. And it has these mobile spikes that keep other men away from his bride. This was the cover of the New York Times Magazine, obviously, in 1976. This was Brooke Shields. This was shot for Vogue magazine sometime in the 80s. This is Peggy Guggenheim. These are actually the earrings she wore that she's famous for wearing, but she also owned these. And these are about 8 or 9 inches across. So they're huge, really almost unwearable. It takes a formidable person to be able to wear these things. This is in the Roxbury house. Sadly, it doesn't look like this anymore in the Roxbury house, but here she is as a younger woman and as an older woman wearing her jewelry. She wore the jewelry very well. I show this because this is the first piece of jewelry he made for her. It says Medusa in hammered wire brass, and he made her this bracelet right after they got off the boat when they first met. And that's also the first piece of gold jewelry he made. That was her wedding ring. And this spells out L-O-U-I-S-A, Louisa. Georgia O'Keeffe, if you were a friend, you might have gotten one of these things. Every one of these things was for someone in his life. Here's my grandfather as a skinny young man. No one thinks of Calder as this skinny guy. When they bought the house on Painter Hill Road in Roxbury, it was completely dilapidated. The windows were boarded up. And this is the ice house that he quickly turns into his studio, which looks like this. So this is 1934, and this fireplace is actually still there in this room. It's changed quite a bit, but the fireplace remains. You can see he's working on these abstract works. This is called The Black Frame. It's 1934. Here he is presenting it in 1934. It's very difficult to show Calder works in motion, and there are a lot of experiments in early photography to show what a Calder sculpture feels like when it's moving. It's not terribly successful, but it's a multiple exposure image, and that's really much more what it looks like today, in color. More pictures in the Ice House studio. Here he's composing a piece he later calls Moneybags of 1934. Now, in 1933, when he bought the house, he spent most of the year rebuilding the house with his own hands. He didn't have any money, and he was working in the house and repairing everything. So 1934 becomes the first big year of production in a house. It's the first piece of property he's owned in his life. He's 36 years old. Here is a composition for a ballet performance. Here's the drawing of it. It's this idea that it would be a giant stage, actually. I mean, think of that square as being maybe 15 or 20 feet in square, and these objects moving in the space. Quite an exotic idea. These are the first sculptures he made for the outdoors. It's also 1934. You see, he made so many things in 1934 and started his vocabulary for the outdoors. This is about 9 feet tall, and the tripod, you're supposed to take it outside and push these feet into the soil to give rigidity to the base, and then the mobile becomes very active. It got damaged, so he started making things out of steel. Thus, this sculpture called Steelfish. Here's a picture by James Thrall Sobey. Sobey was one of the founders of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and was a great friend of Calder's and great supporter of Calder's and had many, many works by Calder, and was an amateur photographer. And now we own all the pictures that Sobey took and his negatives, and we use the pictures as often as we can. That's Steelfish as it looks now. Here's Calder in New York in 1936 in his studio when he's making things like this. So going back to the Mondrian visit and thinking about those colored rectangles oscillate, even though he's already making hanging mobiles, he's still thinking about making a painting which changes, which has variability. So this is the same work, Snake in the Cross, which has is bounded by this frame which comes off the wall, and it changes colors as it spins around. Here's the white panel, also very active, and here it is in the first exhibition in New York, in its first exhibition in 1937 at Pierre Matisse Gallery. Pierre Matisse represented Calder for about 9 years. This is the same exhibition. I'm just putting things in context. So these are the works in those historical photographs. This sculpture was exhibited in 1937 and then was never seen again. And we just showed it for the first time at the Tate at the beginning of this year. It's so exotic. There's a light show. This is just a piece of wire in suspension against this heavy ball. If you light this dramatically, like the wire portraits were lit sometimes, then you could imagine the shadow of this being sort of like this black circle here, but traversing the composition. And then this hoop becomes also a reference to the physical three-dimensional ball and the shadows. There's a whole bunch of physical movement going on with the implied movement going on. Here he is at that time. That's the white panel on the left. And in front of him, Devilfish, which is the very first sculpture he made from a model and then enlarged into a bigger sculpture as a garden sculpture. And here it is at the Matisse Gallery in 1937. Now back to Roxbury. Now, does anyone have a lawn here in Roxbury or hereabouts in Torrington? My grandfather got these goats as an effort to try and keep the grass from growing. This is also what those days looked like. This is Painter Hill Road. I don't know what happened to that stone wall is completely gone. I don't know what happened to it. And of course now there's no more dirt road. I asked our first selectman if she would consider making it a dirt road again, and she said no. This is Roxbury. He's installing, you can see in the background is Steelfish, one of those earliest abstractions. And now he's putting together 9 discs. Roxbury in the old days. Very few trees, just a couple of rotten apple trees. Here we are in 1938. He's building his magnificent studio. His most productive studio of his whole life is this studio, built on the foundation of the old dairy barn. The dairy barn had burned down, and burned down before he bought the property in 1933, and he reutilized it and made this wonderful studio. This round room here was the silo, and he used the round silo to make this nice little kind of study corner over there. This is 1941. You can see above him is actually quite a large mobile. It's all made out of sheet metal, but the sheet metal is aluminum, and it's polished, and it's light reflecting, and it was made for the Hotel Avia in Caracas. Here it is in the ballroom of the hotel. These photographs by Herbert Matter give us so much insight. I'm going to show a series of the objects that are in this room. You can see, well, I'll just go through them. So here he is with Giraffe. You can make it out here. Une fée de Japonais. This is before the United States entered World War II, so he used the title Japanese right here in the middle. Here's aluminum leaves. Again, shiny, light reflecting. Using light as part of the medium of the sculpture is down here. And this is a sculpture I grew up with. It was in my mom's house. It's now at the foundation. And you can see it up here, unpainted in 1941. These kind of photographs are very helpful to assist us in identifying when something was made and dating it and so on, and putting a chronology together. Before I started the foundation, there was not really a sense of how these things related, especially anything before 1955, because that's when he started properly signing and dating things. This is the Roxbury studio. That's Yves Tanguy, the great surrealist painter, setting up the circus for performance in 1941, the same year. There's Yves again. And so the war is on. Calder has helped a lot of his artist friends come to America. This is André Breton, who's living nearby. Here's André Masson, and so on. A lot of his friends came. Again, so this is José Louis Serre, the great architect, Fernand Léger, André Masson, goofing around in Roxbury. The LaSalle car is something of great lure. So it had a rag top, but it burned. And so my grandfather would drive this car summer, winter, rain, snow, anytime with the top down. He'd put on a giant sheepskin coat and drive this car around, and he basically used it like a pickup truck. He's headed now, this is 1941, and these are objects. The whole car is filled with sculpture. He's driving down to New York City to show in his next exhibition. Just some quick pictures of the studio and a few exhibitions. Here, the works that are included in these shows. This is a show in 1947 in New York at his new dealer, Kurt Valentin. This is a cigar box, moneymaker, of course, and my grandfather has made this for his wife for her birthday. She turns 43, and he presents her with a traveling exhibition, miniature sculptures of his own work. And what's really happened is that Calder's becoming an international superstar, and he's traveling all over the world, and Louisa can't come with him all the time. And sometimes she has to travel. I mean, their kids are growing up, and she has to travel too. So he makes her a traveling exhibition so she can always have a piece of him with her wherever she goes. Each one of these little guys comes apart and gets put in these cavities here, and then, gets reassembled. This is just for dazzling pleasure. It's a series of works on paper. I'm not even going to talk about them. It begins in 1944 and runs through even the 70s. You can see how fluid, how obsessed he was with fluidity and the action dynamics of the image and the implication of motion and so forth. He would often paint gouaches like these before he went to his other studio, his sculpture studio. He'd work out some ideas, his mind wriggling on these things, and then go back to the sculpture studio. So, about Connecticut. Here is Calder with the second version of the Black Beast in 1957, and essentially what happened to Calder was he went looking for an iron worker that could help him make bigger and bigger sculpture because he was getting commissions to make things for people's gardens. This guy over here is Carmen Segretario, who owns Segre Ironworks, and the guy all the way on the left is Chippy Geronimo. And Chippy was working for Waterbury Ironworks and on the weekend for Segre's Ironworks, his competition, his boss's competition. And he was, just trying to make a few bucks. So in 1957, Calder was using Waterbury Ironworks to make this sculpture, which is the giant mobile that ends up at JFK International Arrivals Hall. Of course, the building doesn't exist anymore, and the mobile is now in Terminal 4 at JFK. If any of you are traveling through there, it's upstairs at the ticket counters. You gotta look up and see it. Anyway, so Chippy said to Calder, "You're doing all these projects. Maybe you could come over to Segre's and do some projects over there," because Calder kept looking for more and more people that could help him execute these big ideas. This is a little maquette for a piece. Calder doesn't look so happy here. This ultimately is the piece. It was made at Gowans and Knight in Watertown, Connecticut, the only piece they executed for him. It's a motorized contraption here that ends up in a big pool of water in Brussels in 1958. This is the U.S. Pavilion at the International Expo in Brussels, and the whole sequence of the fountains and everything was part of the work of art. So Calder started using a whole bunch of different places to help execute his ideas. So here he is, again with Chippy in the background, but at Segre's Ironworks, making this sculpture, which ends up in Paris. This is at UNESCO in Paris. And so in 57, he was working in 3 different places in Connecticut trying to knock out these things. Still, he needed more help. And eventually, he started working at a big ironworks in France where this sculpture was executed. This is actually made out of stainless steel because the commissioner was this company called International Nickel, and they wanted him to use stainless steel as the medium, which he was happy to do. You can see the scale of it is quite stupendous. So this is 1968, and it was supposed to be 68 feet tall, 67 feet tall. Here you get a sense of the scale of it. Most of these giant sculptures were actually made in France. Here's a few more. Behind him is a scale model. This is the scale model for this giant sculpture for Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's truly, truly giant. Here we are. That's me down here at the dedication of that sculpture. So back to Connecticut. These were kind of the biggest things that Sagers was able to do. This sculpture called Hats Off is at PepsiCo. They have a wonderful sculpture park. Here's my grandpa with the sculpture at Sagres, and here it is as it looks today. And then this is probably the biggest thing that Sagres made in 1973. This is called Flamingo, and it ends up in Chicago. I just like all these documents and little photographs. They would send photographs back and forth to France to my grandfather if he couldn't be here, and he'd make notes and make suggestions. And here it is in the Mies van der Rohe Plaza in Chicago. Sometimes things start out black, and they end up red. That's also at Sagres. This is all Connecticut. Here's the model for a large sculpture. You can see my grandfather's getting a little older. He's 77 years old here. Let's see who's there. So that's Carmen Sagre. That's Andy Schultz. If any of you remember Andy Schultz, he was a great guy, was an architect, and really helped my grandfather a lot with all kinds of things. And there's Frank Paisani, who was the foreman for Carmen Secretaria. Now his son has a steel shop in Waterbury, also called Paisani's. Here's my grandfather approving it, signing it, everyone's happy, and then it ends up here at Storm King Arts Center. The last two pictures are what the Calder studio used to look like, and it looks a lot like that today. This is my grandfather's desk, and you can see, it looks like a big mess, right? It was actually very well organized. What he would do is he would receive a letter from you. If he wrote back to you, he'd put a check on the top of your letter, and the date often, and then put it on the floor. But these piles of correspondence were chronological. That was his filing system. Just drop it on the floor and pile up, and then eventually it'd end up in a box. The amazing thing about that is that this became the basis of the Calder Foundation archive. And now we have 130,000 documents. Letters with his friends, letters with curators, letters with people commissioning sculpture, and so on and so forth. And we're very active in going back and trying to get both sides of the correspondence so we can see the whole story that was expressed. That's my last slide. Thank you very much.